You have been told your entire life that depression is a chemical imbalance, a broken brain, a serotonin shortage. That sentence has shaped how millions of people understand their own suffering. It appears in doctors' offices, in pharmaceutical advertisements, in well-meaning conversations with people who love you. And for decades, it has been repeated so often that it feels like established medical fact. It was never proven. In July 2022, a team of researchers at University College London published the most comprehensive review of the serotonin theory of depression ever conducted. They examined decades of research across 6 major areas: serotonin levels and metabolites, serotonin receptors, the serotonin transporter, tryptophan depletion studies, serotonin gene studies, and gene-stress interactions. Their conclusion, published in Molecular Psychiatry, was downloaded over 1 million times, and it said this: there is no convincing evidence that depression is caused by serotonin abnormalities. The most repeated sentence in mental health turned out to be a sentence that was never confirmed. But this is not just a story about bad science. It is a story about language, about what happens when the words we use to describe human suffering get replaced by words designed to sell a product. And it begins with a word that most people have never thought about: the word itself. The English word depression did not start as a medical term. It entered the language around the year 1400 as an astronomical term. It described the angular distance of a star below the horizon, a sinking, a descent below the line of sight. By the early 15th century, it had shifted to mean a sinking of spirits, a dejection. But it did not enter clinical use until 1905. And the Latin root it comes from is deprimere, de, meaning down, premere, meaning to press down. Before it was a diagnosis, it was a description, a physical one, something pressing you down from above or from within. The people who named this experience were not talking about chemistry. They were talking about weight, about a star falling below the horizon. And anyone who has lived through depression knows that weight, that sinking, is the more honest word. But the Latin is not where this story begins. It begins nearly 25 centuries ago, in Greece, around 400 years before Christ. The physician Hippocrates described a condition he called melancholia. The word comes from 2 Greek roots: melos meaning black, chole meaning bile, black bile. In the Hippocratic system, the body contained 4 humours: blood, yellow bile, phlegm, and black bile. Health was balance, disease was imbalance, and an excess of black bile produced a state of deep sadness, lethargy, fear, and withdrawal from the world. The explanation was physical, but here is what makes that strange. The treatment was not. Hippocrates did not prescribe a substance to correct the bile. He prescribed changes to diet, physical exercise, music, conversation, walks in nature. He treated the person, not the molecule. He understood that the condition lived in the body but was shaped by how the body moved through the world. And that framework, that whole person approach, dominated medicine for nearly 2,000 years. A few centuries later, in 45 BC, the Roman statesman Cicero went further. In his philosophical writings, he distinguished between what we might now call acute and chronic emotional distress. He argued that sorrow could be a natural, appropriate response to circumstance, or it could become something deeper, something persistent that philosophy and reason needed to address. He was drawing lines that modern psychology would not redraw for another 2 millennia. Now here is where it becomes fascinating. In the 4th century, in the Egyptian desert, a monk named Evagrius Ponticus was living in one of the most extreme environments a human being could choose. The Desert Fathers were men who had walked away from cities, from families, from every comfort of the Roman world, and settled in cells carved from rock or built from mud in the wilderness. The silence was total. The heat was crushing. And in that silence, Evagrius identified 8 deadly temptations that afflicted the soul. Among them was acedia. Acedia was not laziness. It was not boredom. Evagrius described it as something far heavier, a deep spiritual listlessness, a crushing weight that made prayer impossible, that made work feel pointless, that made existence itself feel unbearable. And his description of it is one of the most precise accounts of what we now call depression ever committed to paper. He wrote that the noonday demon makes the sun appear to slow down or stop, so the day seems to be 50 hours long. Pause for a second and look at what just happened. A monk in the 4th century described the subjective distortion of time that depressed patients report to their therapists today. The feeling that minutes stretch into hours, that hours stretch into days, that time itself becomes a weight you cannot escape. Evagrius did not call it a chemical imbalance, he called it a demon, but his phenomenological description, the way the experience actually feels from the inside, is more clinically accurate than most modern pharmaceutical pamphlets. There is a pattern here that runs much deeper. Centuries later, in the 6th century, Pope Gregory I took acedia and merged it with another term, tristitia, meaning sorrow. He folded them both into what became the sin of sloth. And in that single move, one of the most sophisticated ancient descriptions of depression was reduced to a moral failure. The lived experience that Evagrius had described with such precision was collapsed into a character flaw. The nuance was lost. But before that happened, someone on the other side of the world had already taken the understanding further than anyone in Europe would for another 1,000 years. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi was an Islamic polymath who lived between 850 and 934 AD. In his treatise called Sustenance for Body and Soul, he became the first person in recorded history to systematically classify mental illness alongside physical illness and argue that both deserved equal attention. But his work on depression was extraordinary. He classified 3 distinct types. The first was huzn, normal sadness, the natural, healthy emotional response to loss or hardship, something that passes with time and does not require treatment. The second was endogenous depression, originating from within the body without an obvious external cause, a condition that comes from the inside, unprovoked, and persists. And the third was reactive depression, triggered by a specific external event but growing beyond the scope of normal grief. He did not collapse these into one condition. He did not offer one explanation. He distinguished between them. He described their different presentations, their different durations, their different severities, and then he developed a treatment. Al-Balkhi proposed that distorted negative thoughts could be identified, examined, challenged, and replaced with rational, evidence-based alternatives. He instructed patients to question whether their despair matched reality, that is, cognitive behavioral therapy. He wrote it in the 9th century. Aaron Beck, the American psychiatrist credited with founding CBT, formalized the same approach in the 1960s. 1100 years later, most people walk right past this. And then there is a tradition older than all of these. In Buddhism, the first noble truth begins with a Pali word, dukkha. It is commonly translated as suffering, but that translation is incomplete, and the incompleteness matters. Dukkha carries a broader meaning: unsatisfactoriness, stress, a fundamental dis-ease woven into the fabric of human experience. The Buddha did not describe dukkha as a malfunction. He described it as a condition of existence, something inherent to being alive, to wanting, to clinging, to resisting what changes. And the treatment he prescribed was not a substance, it was understanding. Right view. The first step of the Eightfold Path. Seeing reality as it is clearly without distortion, not a disorder to be corrected, but a truth to be seen. Here is something most people never realize. 5 traditions, 5 continents, 5 languages, separated by centuries and oceans, and all 5 described depression not as a single chemical malfunction, but as a complex human experience with physical, emotional, social, and spiritual dimensions. Hippocrates treated it with lifestyle. Cicero analyzed it with reason. Evagrius understood it as a spiritual crisis. Al-Balkhi classified it into subtypes and treated it with cognitive reframing. The Buddha framed it as a condition to be understood through awareness. None of them reduced it to one molecule, and none of them were wrong. And then, in the 1950s, everything changed. 2 drugs were discovered entirely by accident. The first was iproniazid, a medication developed in 1952 to treat tuberculosis. Patients in tuberculosis wards were dying. Iproniazid was meant to fight the infection, but doctors began to notice something strange. Patients who were terminally ill, who had every reason to be despairing, were becoming cheerful, energized. The drug was not designed to affect mood. It was a side effect, but it was unmistakable. The second accidental discovery came in 1957, when Swiss psychiatrist Roland Kuhn found that a compound called imipramine had a powerful effect on depressive symptoms. It became the first tricyclic antidepressant. Both drugs affected a class of brain chemicals called monoamine neurotransmitters, including serotonin. And from these two accidental observations, from side effects no one was looking for, a hypothesis was born. In 1967, a British psychiatrist named Alec Coppin published a paper called The Biochemistry of Affective Disorders. In it, he formalized what became known as the serotonin hypothesis of depression. The logic was simple. These drugs help depression. These drugs affect serotonin. Therefore, low serotonin must cause depression. It sounds reasonable, but it is the equivalent of saying aspirin cures headaches, therefore headaches are caused by aspirin deficiency. The theory was reverse-engineered from a drug effect. It was a working hypothesis, a starting point for investigation, not a conclusion. And for years it remained exactly that, a hypothesis that researchers were testing, an open question. And here is the detail that changes everything. In 1987, the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly released a drug called Prozac, fluoxetine, the first blockbuster selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It was marketed not as a new experimental treatment, but as a correction, a fix for a broken brain. And 10 years later, in 1997, the United States Food and Drug Administration relaxed the rules on direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising. Before 1997, pharmaceutical companies could not advertise prescription drugs directly to patients on television in the way they do today. After 1997, they could. And what followed was a flood. Television commercials showing sad people becoming happy after taking a pill. Magazine spreads with smiling faces. Doctor's office pamphlets explaining that depression is simply a chemical imbalance that medication can correct. Hundreds of millions of advertising dollars over the next 2 decades, transforming a working hypothesis into established public knowledge. One of the first Prozac pamphlets said this, quote, "Prozac does not artificially alter your mood, and it is not addictive. It can only make you feel more like yourself by treating the imbalance that causes depression." End quote. That sentence was not published in a peer-reviewed journal. It was printed on a marketing pamphlet. And over 70% of surveyed patients reported exposure to antidepressant direct-to-consumer advertising. The chemical imbalance theory of depression was not proven in a laboratory. It was installed in the public mind through the largest pharmaceutical marketing campaign in history. If this is starting to connect some dots for you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. In 2005, researchers Lacasse and Leo published a paper in PLOS Medicine called Serotonin and Depression, a disconnect between the advertisements and the scientific literature. They documented rigorously the gap between what the advertisements were claiming and what the published research actually supported. But the marketing machine was already too powerful. The message had taken root. Nearly 2 decades later, in 2024, a study in Frontiers in Psychology traced exactly how the chemical imbalance belief had spread through media, clinical practice, and public consciousness. The finding was clear. The belief did not originate from the evidence. It originated from the advertising. This is where the science gets uncomfortable. In July 2022, Professor Joanna Moncrieff and her colleagues at University College London published a systematic umbrella review in molecular psychiatry. An umbrella review does not examine individual studies, it examines entire bodies of research. Systematic reviews of systematic reviews. It is, in effect, a review of everything we know. Moncrieff's team looked at all of it. Decades of data on serotonin levels and metabolites, which showed no consistent difference between depressed and non-depressed individuals. Studies on serotonin receptors which found no reliable link to depression. Research on the serotonin transporter gene once considered strong evidence, which failed to replicate in larger studies. Tryptophan depletion experiments which could not reliably induce depression even when serotonin was artificially lowered. And gene-by-environment interaction studies which produced inconsistent and often contradictory results. Their conclusion was unambiguous. In Professor Moncrieff's own words, quote, "It is always difficult to prove a negative, but I think we can safely say that after a vast amount of research conducted over several decades, There is no convincing evidence that depression is caused by serotonin abnormalities, particularly by lower levels or reduced activity of serotonin." End quote. The paper was downloaded over 1 million times, and it confirmed what some researchers had quietly acknowledged for years. In a separate interview, Moncrieff put it more plainly. Quote, "The serotonin hypothesis has been widely publicized and presented and accepted as fact by many people, but it has been understood by researchers that it is not well supported for some time now." End quote. Some researchers have pushed back. A team at King's College London argued that the Umbrella Review has methodological limitations and that the role of serotonin in mood regulation is more nuanced than a single review can capture. That is a legitimate scientific disagreement, and it deserves to be heard. Serotonin does play a role in brain function. No serious researcher disputes that. The question is whether low serotonin causes depression. And on that specific claim, after decades of research, the supporting evidence is not there. Here is something critical, and I need you to hear this clearly. This does not mean antidepressants do not work. That is not what the review says. What it says is that the reason they sometimes help is not what we were told. The benefits may come from neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new connections, from glutamate modulation, from emotional blunting that gives a person space to function, or from mechanisms we do not yet fully understand. Challenging the explanation is not the same as rejecting the treatment. If you are taking medication for depression, this video is not a reason to stop. Talk to your doctor. The theory was wrong. The medicine may still be helping you. Those two things can both be true at the same time. What the review does reveal is this: the most widely repeated explanation for why people suffer was never based on confirmed evidence. It was based on an assumption from the 1960s that became a marketing message in the 1990s, and it stuck. Because it was simple. Because it removed the complexity. Because it told you your suffering has one cause and one fix. And simplicity, when it replaces truth, is not clarity, it is erasure. But the people who first named this experience knew better. Hippocrates described melancholia as a disturbance of the whole body and treated it with diet, exercise, music, and conversation. Cicero distinguished between grief and chronic despair and argued both deserved thoughtful examination. Evagrius described acedia as a force that distorted the experience of time itself, a demon that made the sun stand still. Al-Balkhi classified 3 distinct types of depression and developed cognitive therapy 1100 years before modern psychology rediscovered the same method. And the Buddha named dukkha not as a disease but as a condition of being alive, treatable not by correcting a molecule, but by correcting how you see. Every one of these traditions understood something that the chemical imbalance theory erased. Depression is not one thing with one cause. It never was. It is a convergence of biological, psychological, social, and spiritual factors, and the original words from every tradition told you that. The Latin said it is a weight. The Greek said it is in the body. The Roman said it is in the reason. The Christian monk said it is in the soul. The Islamic scholar said it is in the mind. The Buddhist said it is in the nature of existence. They were all describing the same human experience from a different angle, and they were all, in their own way, more accurate than a pamphlet that said it was a chemical imbalance. It is a bit like inheriting a house and being told the only thing that matters is the wiring. You spend decades focused on the electrical system, you call in specialists, you replace the cables, and the lights still flicker, until someone finally looks at the foundation, the walls, the windows, the air moving through the rooms, and says this was never just an electrical problem, it was always the whole house. The wiring matters. Nobody is saying it does not. But if you only look at the wiring, you will miss the cracks in the foundation. You will miss the window that does not close. You will miss the room where no light reaches at all. So what does this mean for you? It means the sentence you were given, depression is a chemical imbalance, was a map. And the map was too small. Not wrong in every detail, not useless, but incomplete. It pointed to one room in a building with many, and the people who described this building thousands of years ago, in Latin, in Greek, in Arabic, in Pali, they were not guessing. They were standing in the rooms the map left out. They knew the house had a foundation, and walls, and windows, and air. They knew the suffering was real, and the causes were many. and they described it with words that, if you trace them back to their roots, still carry that knowledge inside them. The question was never whether your pain is real. It is. The question is whether the story you were given about your pain is big enough to hold the truth. And if a Greek physician in 400 BC, a Roman statesman in 45 BC, a Christian monk in the 4th century, an Islamic scholar in the 9th century, a Buddhist teaching from 25 centuries ago, and a million-download review at University College London all point in the same direction, then maybe the answer was never a single molecule. Maybe it was always the whole person. The Latin word is still deprimere. It still means to press down. The weight has not changed. But perhaps the way you understand it just did.